just mentioned, took Visitor out of JBehavior and did the first release of it. Wrote a blog post a number of years ago asking what's the difference between all of these? Because people, we don't like being uncertain. We don't like being confused. And her blog post comes to the amazing conclusion that they're all the same. They're just called different things. Now, I think there is one, on the level of ATDD, BDD, and SBE, where SBE is Specification By Example, I think there's very little that you can point to. There are spreadsheets out there on the Tinternet where consultants have done checklists about saying BDD includes this and ATDD includes that, but they're all garbage as far as I'm concerned. TDD, though, is important because TDD is slightly different in that TDD is typically seen as a technically facing activity. So although TDD works in pretty much the same way as BDD, we're not necessarily trying to involve the business people. So I've seen Brian Marek tweet about, I don't know what all this BDD tool nonsense is about. Why don't you just get them to the whiteboard and show them the Ruby? Well, that's because most of the bankers that I've worked with, it's difficult enough to talk to them in the first place, but to show them Ruby would just be too far out. So I'm going to try and draw this one out. Best TDD practitioners do three particular things. TDD is about writing the test first. So you're thinking about how the component should work. You're working from the outside, trying to picture what that interface should be. You use examples to clarify how it should behave. So those examples are, in fact, each test. Each unit test you write is an example which specifies what the input should be, what the state of the system should be, and what the outcome should be, and asserts on that. And if you're really good at TDD, what you're trying to do is do what Konstantin was talking about in the previous session, which is you're trying to reflect the domain in your design and in the wording of your actual code. So the test should be using domain terms, business terms. BDD builds on this. BDD is about delivering value. We're talking about what is it that our customers are wanting. We're having discussions with our customers. And so we're still working from the outside. Konstantin and I will be trading blows outside later about whether the UI is involved here or not. But nonetheless, we're still talking about delivering some form of value. We discover examples collaboratively. I'll talk about the 3 Amigos meeting a little bit later on. But essentially, it's that collaboration that Konstantin was showing in the previous talk where we're talking regularly and effectively using the business domain language with our customers, with the business people. And those scenarios, the features and scenarios that if you're in the previous session you'll have seen and that I'll show in a minute, those are living documentation. They document how the system should behave and they tell us when our implementation and our specification begin to deviate. So that's number one. Number two, and this is probably the most important thing. If you only take one thing away from the next 40 minutes, it's this. It's that although I'm a contributor to Cucumber, although I've written a book about it and I do a lot of training in Cucumber, although I think it's a really excellent tool, BDD is not about the tools. BDD is definitely about the collaboration. So how does that play into this original definition, or not original, but this definition that Dan offered up a number of years ago? Because here he talks about high automation. BDD offers the possibility of having automated living documentation. It offers us that as the end goal, your sort of nirvana. But there's definitely a set of steps that we have to go through before we get there. To reference Liz Keogh again, she says that having conversations is more important than capturing the conversations, is more important than automating the conversations. And this is a message that I find, whenever I come across a company or an organization who have tried to somehow shortcut and go straight into automating the conversations, they are always in a world of pain. Because it's not about have we done it right, it's have we done the right thing? Are we doing what the business want? What is the most valuable thing? And the biggest thing that teams struggle with is ignorance about what they're trying to achieve. Every time you sit down and type away at a keyboard or draw a squares and lines diagram, you're trying to understand the domain, the problem domain for which you are proposing a solution. And unless you have a really good understanding of that, you're going to deliver something that is suboptimal, at least on one level. And so it's the collaboration, it's the discussion between you and your business people that really drives successful software delivery, and it really drives the understanding of the behavior that is the root, the foundations of behavior-driven development. Liz expands a bit further, and she basically says, get good at having those conversations. Start talking to your business more frequently. Get to a point where you really understand what they want, and only then start working out how you're going to turn it into stories, and only then think about how you're going to automate that. So reach for the tools late in the day. So it's probably no surprise that collaboration is essential, is the core finding from this. We don't want to use the tools unless we have done the collaboration first. So these funny three guys here seem to have a strange aspect ratio. But anyway, the funny three guys here are the three Amigos from the frankly not very funny film, I would say. And I find it's a shame that they were chosen as the sort of avatar of the core practice of BDD as practiced by the Cucumber teams. But nonetheless, there you go. And the three Amigos are there because we think that when you're sitting down to collaborate to try and work out what examples are core that describe the behavior, there should be representatives of three core domains. And that's the business, the development team, and the test team. So I'll talk more about roles later on, but here when we're talking about the three Amigos meeting, we want to have not necessarily three people, but at least three roles represented. And those are the three that make the specification workshop or the three Amigos meeting core. You may need other people there. You may want security experts or UI experts. You may need someone from a particular part of the business. You may need someone from legal as well. But unless you've got those three different viewpoints there, you're likely to miss something out. And you know why that is, obviously, because the business people are thinking about what they're delivering to their customers. Developers are thinking about curly braces and object-oriented abstractions and how am I going to fit this in with my Googling. And the testers are thinking, how am I going to break this? So these are three very different approaches and three very different viewpoints on what you want out of a specification. But unless you've got all three of them, you will not be able to survive, your system won't survive exposure to the real world, because your customers may not be testers, but they will certainly try and break it. And even if it's not your customers, someone else out there is going to try and break it. So Aslak wrote a blog post, I think it was last year, trying to make this, to articulate this, because what we in the Cucumber Limited organization find time and time again is that the people who come to us and say, we would really like you to come and do some consulting with us, we'd like you to come and give us some training, are predominantly QA test managers. Right? And they're coming because they've heard that Cucumber does test automation, and quite frankly, they've had enough of QTP, and they would like some magic pixie dust to be sprinkled all over their testers, and suddenly, it's all going to be beautiful. It'll be written in the business language. Everyone will be happy singing and dancing. And this is a really hard problem to get across. That, probably it's probable that your problems are starting somewhat before the test automation happens. We need to get you involved more closely with your business. We need to get you working closer with your development teams. You will probably need, actually, I'm probably jumping ahead here, but you will probably need some development skills to be able to do test automation effectively. And this comes as a bit of a shock, and they're not very happy about this. But we keep plodding along down this line, and the companies that do work in a collaborative way and start having developers, testers, and business people talk together have a much more successful set of outcomes. So the collaboration that we're aiming for is to generate examples. So Konstantin talked about these examples. It's the examples about how does that work? What happens when this sort of data gets input? What happens in this occasion? Oh, really? Does it work just like that on a leap year as well? What happens if that falls on a bank holiday? And these are the sort of examples that you really need to nail if you're going to get most modern complex systems to work. And so this yellow blocks in the middle, this is where we would generate the examples. This is the three Amigos meeting or specification workshop. It's where we actively face-to-face collaborate if at all possible. And you'll see that the inputs to this are user stories. So the business will typically come to this workshop with a set of candidate user stories. And we'll challenge those user stories with examples. Well, how does that work if this is the case? What happens if the system goes down? Blah, blah, blah. And so we bring up these different examples, and the business try and respond to us. So there's a prerequisite here that the business have got to done their homework. They've got to have done a bit of research. They can't sort of waltz in there with blue sky thinking, and you ask them questions, they go, oh, I don't know, I'm going to have to go away and think about that. So they come in with some user stories, hopefully with some acceptance criteria or conditions of satisfaction as well, and we challenge them both with concrete examples. And by challenging them with those concrete examples, we can get concrete answers, and those will generate ideas. What typically you find is that there are acceptance criteria that they'd assumed we knew about, or that they just were so inbred or ingrained in their thinking that they hadn't bothered to articulate them. We also might find other user stories that they had neglected to think about, or exceptions that were, well, yeah, okay, on a Thursday it doesn't quite work like that. And you find these things out by asking those concrete examples. And as we begin to build up a better picture of that user story, we can find different ways of slicing it. So my pet bugbear, and the pet bugbear of many people that I work with, is that user stories are really generally far too big. A user story should not just fit in an iteration. You should be delivering user stories all the way through that iteration. So my rule of thumb is a user story should take you about 1 to 3 days, preferably 1 day, to take off the backlog and deliver to done. Now, I know that's probably a long way from where most of us are, but it's an aspiration. And to be able to achieve that, what you have to be able to do is slice those user stories into smaller things that you can deliver faster. And the way not to do that is to horizontally say, okay, we'll do the database today, and we'll do the UI tomorrow. Not a good idea. We want to find thin slices. And the identifying examples and acceptance criteria are a great way of partitioning the problem space. And in fact, J.B. Rainsberger, he goes for a completely different approach. He says, I don't even bother with user stories. I just sit down and we talk about features, and we talk about examples, and we talk about acceptance criteria, and then what we do is we take the first 2 or 3 really important acceptance criteria and we just implement them. So he doesn't even start from a story and try splitting it down. He gathers a bag, if you like, of related acceptance criteria and then builds a task, a user story-like task out of that. So you've got this feedback loop here in the 3 Amigos meeting where you've getting the input from the business, you're challenging it with the concrete examples, and the output of, the outcome of the responses then allows you to refactor the stories and have a better knowledge of the domain. And down here, well, obviously you get code, because at some point you're going to want to build the system. But if you're getting this right and you're happy with your conversation, then you can use tools like Cucumber and Specflow to automate those examples and generate executable specification or living documentation, 2 terms that are used. One of the parts of the initial training workshop that we typically run when people are thinking about implementing or using BDD is how you're going to fit it into your existing process. Because it's a meeting, it's a workshop of sorts, it has to be scheduled. If your business are not co-located, you have to organize how to fit it in. You have to make sure that they're ready and available. I'm personally not a big fan of 8-hour planning meetings. I think I can concentrate properly for about half an hour. An hour is pretty much my limit. And so you need to work out, if you're going to have a 3 Amigos specification workshop, how are you going to fit that into your typical iteration? So this is a Scrum picture I've put up there, but merely as a placeholder. This is something that depends on your organization. It depends on whether your business and you are co-located with you. It depends whether they're accessible all the time. It depends whether you have to schedule meetings with them 2.5 months in advance. All of these things play into it. So you can't, there's no one size fits all. Typically, in the best case, when you're co-located and your business are really committed to trying to help the development teams succeed in delivering those solutions, you would have either regular meetings throughout the sprint, or you'd replace your grooming session with one of these 3 Amigos workshops. But nonetheless, it's something that needs to be thought about because you have to fit it in, it has to work with your organization. So that's point 3. Point 4, I want to talk a little bit about Cucumber. So Cucumber is a trivially simple product, okay? I want to blow away some of the myths around it. All it does is link features through scenarios and steps to your application. So a feature is a pure text file, and it contains examples, which are called scenarios. And each scenario is made up of one or more steps. And the steps start with keywords, which in English are given, when, then, and, or but. Gherkin is the name of the syntax. It's the language with which you construct those feature files. But it's a very simple structure. And in fact, that's most of the keywords in it. The glue code is where we write the bits that join the plain English through to the application that we want to test. So these were the step definitions that you were seeing in Constantine's talk if you were in it before. But basically, they're just plain Java or C# or PHP functions. And the application that you're trying to test, well, you have to call it through its API. You may call it using something funky like Selenium WebDriver, or you may go straight in using XML or some other, or JSON or some other type of interface, or you might just do a standard procedure call. But I'm going to go through it in a little bit more detail just to get it to get some context and grounding here. So here's a very simple feature. It's about a game where you can answer questions and you get scores. And so far, I've written 2 scenarios. This little blurb at the top is just free text to help give you some context around this particular feature that we're talking about. So the first scenario says that it's about when the score should start at 0 when you register a new team. And the second scenario says that if you answer a correct, easy answer, you should score 10 points. Hopefully, there's nothing complicated there. But if you read that, does it make sense as an English phrase? Yeah. The wonderful thing about this is something that you give back to your business. You can write it in conjunction with your business people, or you can write it out of band after your specification workshop, but then you can pass it back to them and get feedback for them to say, this is what we talked about. Yes, you have captured it correctly. And then once you've linked it up to your application under test, this is in fact what drives the execution of your scenarios, it drives the execution of your executable specification. In fact, it is your executable specification. And when you run it, it changes color. It changes color to tell you whether those steps passed or failed. So basically, it goes green, it's good, it passes. It goes red, it means that something went wrong. And when you're actually running it on the command line, when it goes red, it gives you a little bit more information. It tells you where it went wrong. It tells you what assertion failed. But this is where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to useful documentation of what your system should do that you or your business can press the run button and then go and see which ones went green and which ones went red. If it went green, we're all good. If something went red, it means either there's a defect in your software or your specification is out of date. And that way, you can update your specification, which is why it's living documentation, because unlike other documentation, this documentation tells you when it's out of date, which is quite funky, because I'm sure that you've seen documentation. I'm pretty sure that every single one of your organization has out-of-date documentation sitting on your local hard drives, that you have system designs that are somewhat subtly not quite like what your system actually is. So how do we link the lines, the step definitions, the steps in the step definitions and the scenarios through to the step definitions? Right, let me try that one again. How do we link the steps in our scenarios through to the step definitions that will actually call our application? So all the Cucumber family of applications do it through pattern matching, regular expression pattern matching. In Ruby, this I register a team step would be implemented like this. So in Ruby, the regular expression sits between the slashes. Regular expression gurus will know that the little caret at the beginning means the beginning of a line, and the dollar is for the end. So this basically says it's going to match the whole line, and it's got to match it with this text. And if it matches that, then it calls this method or this phrase. And here what it does is it uses a keyword, something that comes out of the Ruby implementation of Cucumber, which is pending, which essentially throws an exception. Now, these snippets, as they're called, are generated by Cucumber for you. So once you've written your scenario, you point Cucumber at it, and it goes, I can't find any matches for this. Would you like me to generate a regular expression and a bit of code that would be called the next time you run it? And you go, oh, thank you very much, that's so helpful. And then you cut and paste it into a code file, and you've got something that you can work with. So Ruby, obviously, is a wonderful language, very terse. It's not everybody's choice of language. Java is slightly more verbose. This is what would be generated if you're using the Java version of Cucumber. So here you've got imports, you've got more gubbins. But essentially, it's the same thing. You've got the regular expression, and you've got a pending exception being thrown. C# surprisingly looks very similar. I wonder, do you think the C# people had a look at Java when they were? Anyway, again, a regular expression. There's one thing that's better actually in C#. Strange enough, there's a few things that are better in C# along the way, but the ability to have string constants actually delineate them are great, because in Java what you end up with in the end is escaping backslashes, and so your regular expression strings do get to be quite hideous. Anyway, so this is what it looks like in C#. And now I want to have a look at the snippet for the next step, which is then my score is, or a step. And here what you'll see is that there's a capture group. This is another regular expression term. This is where once it's matched the regular expression, then the regular expression matcher has access to the bits between the bracket that matched. So here it's the my score is, and you remember there were two steps. One was my score is 0, and the other was my score is 10. So depending on which step it matched against, this will either have matched against the 0 or 10, and it will get passed into this method as the first parameter. So essentially what we're saying here is that you can do some funky pattern matching, you can capture parts of the step and pass it into the code and do stuff with it. Great. It's not a great method though, is it? So P0 is hardly the most meaningful, parameter name. That dot here in the capture group, that represents any character, but actually scores are numbers, aren't they? So it'd be nice to be able to say it's just for numbers. So the first thing I think that we should point out is that the snippets that Cucumber generates for you, they're just to make your life easier. You can go and edit them any way you like. So let's do that. First off, let's turn that to score, because I think if it's a score, let's call it a score. Up there in the expression, regular expression, let's turn that into, let's only match on digits. And then this pending, let's go and put some implementation in there. So we're going to assert that the score is equal to the game score. So here we go. In about 8 minutes there, I covered all the major features of getting your first scenario actually up and running. And these work in every language that Cucumber works in. So number 5, Cucumber, as I said, there's a family of Cucumber implementations. Konstantin was talking about Behat, which is one of the family. Cucumber itself has got Ruby Cucumber and Java Cucumber. Tech Talk ported Cucumber to .NET, and it's called Specflow. So I'm actually focusing on Cucumber and Specflow simply because those seem to be the ones that most people I work with use anyway. And I've come across a number of differences that are really, some of them are more important than others. So the first is to do with namespaces. So you remember that we had the keywords at the beginning of each step, the given, when, then, and, or but. In Cucumber land, it just ignores them. Okay? Let me say that again, because it comes as a lot of a surprise, a big surprise to a lot of people, is they're completely ignored. We don't care. In fact, we don't care so much, you can replace them all with asterisks, and Cucumber will work in exactly the same way. So as far as Cucumber is concerned, it's the text that comes after the keyword that's important, and it doesn't matter what the keyword is at the beginning of the line. Specflow is different. Specflow says givens are very different from whens that are very different from thens. So you can have the same text coming after a given as you've got after a when, and it will match a different pattern. So you specify which one you want it to match. And that therefore gives you 3 different namespaces: given namespace, a when namespace, and a then namespace, which it makes my head spin when I think about why would you want to do that. But they've got very compelling reasons. Of course, it gets more complicated when you introduce ands and buts, because then your step goes into the namespace of the nearest given when then keyword that comes before the and or the but. And at that point, anyway. So luckily, rather than change the system to be completely compatible, they introduced a new namespace called step definition, which is a global namespace. And so now you can make Specflow behave like Cucumber and all sane people would want. There's differences about how you actually invoke things. So a lot of the stuff that goes on in the Cucumber world is around paths and plugins. You have to specify stuff when you invoke it. And that's stuff that gets covered in the documentation. It's not always transparent, it has to be said. But once you get it going there, or if you're using one of the build tools like Maven, then it all works really sweetly. Specflow also does a lot of stuff, but it does it completely behind the scenes. Specflow, if you want to plug in a different unit test framework, you have to go and find, you've got to go and find an app properties file and edit that in bizarre ways. It does some magic generation based on project files behind the scenes. So I had lots of joys when I was trying to port this to a mono implementation. But hopefully you'll never come across any of these. Now this is important. So obviously, we were talking, even in Constantine's example, when we were talking about the conferences and the tracks, there's probably going to be, between those different steps, the different lines, you're going to want to share the game. You're going to want to share the track, share the conference, share some information. And when you're working with just one feature file, it's fine. You could have local or global variables. But we all know what happens in applications when we use global variables to share state. We all get very confused and we do things that are wrong. So all of these implementations of Cucumber come with bits of functionality to help you share data between steps in a structured way. Ruby has got this thing called the world object, which is like the context object that PHP has got, where you sort of chuck stuff into it in a ordered way and you can pull it out again. Java uses dependency injection because, hey, we love dependency injection. And because we love it so much, you can choose between 6 different implementations of dependency injection. Whereas Specflow, they go back to the context object, but they have 3 different layers, at least, of context object. And you can do injection and scenario level and feature level sharing of data. So once again, Specflow goes further, does more, and I think possibly confuses people. Maybe that's just me, actually. Then there are hooks. So the specifications that we're writing, those scenarios with steps in them, we want them to be really, really easily understood by our business people. So we don't want to talk in them about spinning up web services. We don't want to talk in them about cleaning up databases. These are technical implementations that we want to leave well alone. And so hooks are really useful things. They're essentially bits of code, just Java or Ruby or C#, that you write, and you put, instead of putting a given when then annotation on it, you give it a hook annotation. And if it's a before or after hook, it will run either before or after each scenario. And it allows you to do tidy up work. There are different levels of hooks. There are different flavors of hooks. There are ways of limiting when the hooks run. It gets kind of gnarly. When you have lots of hooks, you may have ordering and you want to have them run in a particular order. So it becomes implementation dependent and it becomes confusing. But the nice thing about hooks is that it's confusing for the developers. Yeah, your manager, your business person, your product owner doesn't have to worry about that. It's not in the feature file. And again, Specflow pulls out all the stops. You have before and after, but you have it before and after each step, you have before and after each feature, before and after each test run, even before and after each scenario block, which again is to do with given, when, then, and the and. So, yes, loads and loads of possible things to confuse people with. So there's more than one form of documentation. So this is number 6, prefer living documentation. So the reason I prefer living documentation is, as I mentioned earlier, because if it runs against your system, it will tell you when it's out of date. And there's very little developers in here. Have you ever read a comment that clearly doesn't apply to the code that it appears to be commenting? Right. This is because that's what happens to text. It gets cut and pasted, people forget to update it, and this is what happens to, if this is called living documentation, then maybe we should call it dead documentation. Dead documentation rots, like all dead things. It's living documentation that self-heals. So I want to dissect a little bit a feature file. So it's the same feature file that we looked at earlier, and over on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got some of the artifacts that we generate as part of a typical Agile team's way of working. We've got our user story, we've got our acceptance criteria, and the examples which would lead to unit test or acceptance test. So most of these, in fact all of these, can be migrated into the feature file. So the examples, each example gives rise to a separate scenario, and so we can just get rid of the examples as soon as we've implemented them. The acceptance criteria, now here I'm departing from some usages of feature files. So again, Constantine and I can talk about this afterwards. I write the acceptance criteria that I've implemented so far in the free text area at the top of the feature file. Because as far as I'm concerned, it's the acceptance criteria that I'm satisfying that are important to the business. I do not see user stories as an important thing to keep after they've been implemented. So the acceptance criteria get recorded here, so they've been documented. And the user story, bye. Because the user story, so here, I just want to make sure that I've made that clear. It's not that I don't think user stories are valuable. They're very valuable. They're great things to have conversations around. They're great things to help you structure your work, think about how you're going to do things, identify dependencies, discover acceptance criteria that you haven't discovered, all these wonderful things. But what they don't do is document your system, because user stories build on top of each other. The user story that you started with has no meaning after you've implemented maybe one that adds upon it, modifies it when someone brings in a change. They're part of the evolution of the system, but they're not something that in any way documents the state of the system now. Other forms of documentation are also necessary. So you might need to install it. There may be performance, the security things. There are lots of different aspects of software that aren't covered just by the functional spec that I was talking about. So don't forget the testers. I see Unruly are here. They got challenged yesterday by a tester who said, why don't you have any testers on your team? The tester, a good tester is a huge benefit to your team, and will bring a different viewpoint on how to exercise the code aggressively. We'll also have skills such as exploratory testing, equivalence partitioning, all sorts of things that most software developers weren't taught at university and haven't been exposed to as they went through their career. So testers are really important in my estimation. We saw earlier the testing pyramid. Basically, we know, so the testing period here, I've taken bits out of the middle. I have no text in the middle anymore because I find that it just confuses matters. But essentially, as you go up the pyramid, you're testing more and more of the application stack with each test. So right at the bottom, you're just testing little individual bitty bits. And at the top, you're testing the whole thing. And the width of the pyramid represents sort of how many tests there will be at that level. But the bit that I want to point out here is that top bit. You still need exploratory and manual testing. We're never going to get to a point in almost every domain I've ever seen where you can do without that at all. And that's where your testers really come in valuable, as well as at the 3 Amigos specification workshop. If you're not familiar with the Agile testing quadrants, I'm not going to go through them here. You should buy these books, which are very good books. I'm not going to talk about them. But I want to make clear that to build on the fact that I talked about earlier, that it's not just about test automation. BDD is not just for testers. So some teams, they bring in BDD, they do a lot of work, they do a lot of training, and then they go, oh yeah, our testers will write all the specifications. No. So the reason why that's not going to happen is because there's going to be a lot of code going into these step definitions. There's going to be, in a larger system, we won't just talk directly from the step definition to the application. We'll have support code. We'll want to do things like abstractions. We'll want data builders. We'll want all sorts of software engineering techniques to help keep our specification suite, our test suite maintainable. And most test departments don't have those skills. It's just not part of the skill set that they've come up through. So this is an area where you need to collaborate. You need to have testers and developers working together if you want effective test automation. But you need them working together because we want to develop a ubiquitous language. So, we also need to make sure that we get our tests at the right level of detail. So you can get very detailed. Again, Constantine and I are going to be talking about this later. I think we need to move away from having too much detail there. Kent Beck said he wants to do as little testing as possible to reach a given level of confidence. Matt Wynn uses this wonderful analogy of a tent. So has anyone got a tent? Have you noticed that they've got lots and lots of little ropes hanging off the side and the back? How often have you used those? You use them every time. Okay. That says something about either your tent or where you're camping. In general, people don't use them because they're there for when it's windy. And when do we go camping? In the summer. Yeah, right. So, sorry? Okay. So we can talk about tents afterwards as well. So this analogy is breaking down. The pegs are there, the things are there typically because in bad weather, the tent needs more support than in good weather. And this particular one doesn't have those sort of pegs anyway, but when you think you're dealing a risky area of your code, when you're working somewhere that's business critical, things may go wrong, you want to put out more pegs and more guy ropes. And in this case, that's what your tests are. And the final bit I want to say on this topic is that we want to keep things focused. So you read your scenario and think, what is this scenario trying to show us? What is it verifying? What behavior am I demonstrating that I've implemented this successfully? And then read the steps and go, is that information important to showing this behavior? And I would suggest that often we will be putting things in there that aren't necessary. It's not easy. Constantine talked about 4 years to get his head around BDD and 2 years to get his head around DDD. John Jagger's in the room. I have to mention CyberDojo. CyberDojo is a wonderful, wonderful tool for getting better at things. Mostly it gets used for test-driven development. But as we know, test-driven development is very similar to behavior-driven development. But also, look, it's got Specflow in it. So you can practice Specflow at CyberDojo. Oh, it's got Cucumber in it. You can practice Cucumber at CyberDojo. So it also is a BDD practice area. Have I got 2 minutes? Is that right? Yes. We'll have a quick game, right? So this is the fingers on buzzers. There you go. XP 2016, call for papers is open now. Right, there we go. I did it with 12 things. Now I'm going to show you 10 things that you need to know, base 2. BDD demands collaboration. Examples facilitate feedback. Those are the two most important things that I hope you take away from my talk today. So I showed you 12. You don't need 12, you just need these 2. It's about collaboration and feedback. Living documentation is a great thing. And as a final, I've been asked to mention, and it's also self-serving, I'm running a system architecture workshop here on November the 25th and 26th, it says there. So there you go. So sign up if you're around. Thank you very much. I'm around all day and some of tomorrow if you want to ask questions. Cheers.